Hello and welcome to Module 9 in our Django series. This module is going to focus on user authentication, and this session is part 1 of 2 for this module. As an introduction, the Django authentication framework handles both user authentication as well as user authorization. User authentication means verifying that the user is who he or she says that they are, and user authorization means verifying the permissions that the authenticated user has. Now, the core of the Django authentication system is prescribed in the django.contrib.auth module. In terms of installation, the required configuration is already included in our default settings.py file, and this was done when we issued our Django admin start project command. Because the required configuration is already there, if you look at your settings.py file, you should be able to see in the installed app setting django.contrib.auth already installed, as well as django.contrib.content types. Now, from the previous slide, we know django.contrib.auth contains the core of the Django authentication system. Django.contrib.content types allows for permissions to be associated with project models. Now, in the middleware setting, we have our session middleware as we saw last time, and we also have authentication middleware, which associates users with requests using sessions. To complete the installation, it is required to run manage.pymigrate, but as you know, we've already done this when we created our models. So from our point of view, the installation of the Django authentication framework is already complete. Now let's talk about the content types framework a little so that you get a brief idea of what it's about. And Django has a content types framework that tracks all models in our Django projects. This, of course, was installed when we issued our Django admin start project command. And at the heart of the content types framework is the content type model. Every instance of the content type class contains two fields, app label and model, that are unique for every model. There's also a property name, which is essentially the human readable name of the instance of the content type class. Now you can find the content type class at django.contrib.contenttypes.models.contenttype. And if you're wondering about the difference between a field and a property, let's go now to our command prompt to understand that a little better. And we'll also look at the fields app label and model on one of the models that we already have in our project. So let's go now to our command prompt. Change directory to your virtual environment, activate the environment, start VS Code. You can minimize the window, change directory to your container folder, and start Python shell. We'll start by importing the student model, and now we can check the app label. So app label is part of the model's metadata. So if you type in student._meta.app label, you get the app name. Student._meta.model will give you the class name. Student._meta.label will give you the app.model name, right? Now let's look at the difference between a field and a property. For that, you need to come to your models.py file, and we'll add a property to the grade section model. We need to put in a property decorator and then our method. That's going to be current strength, and it's going to take self as argument, just like our str methods. Return, we'll use a formatted string, and that's going to be year and section within curly braces, self.gradesecID, comma, current strength, and within curly braces, self.current student count. Right? That's all. Now the difference between a field and property is this. The fields are essentially columns in our database table, right? The property is not a column in our database table. It's just added onto the model. Because the property is not a column, We don't need to run make migrations and migrate, but we need to exit the Python shell in order for that property to take effect. So exit and start up the shell again. Import grade section, get one of the objects, and then we can access the property. And that's it, right? Now let me show you how the content types framework functions. So for that, we'll use a teacher model. We've got to import content type. Now let's use a variable. So that will be content type equal to content type dot objects dot get for model, and that will be teacher. Now we've also got to import the permission model. So from django.contrib.auth.models import permission. And then we have a variable perms for permissions equal to permission dot objects dot filter, and here we say content type equal to that variable value that we used earlier. Right? Now, if we put in p dot code name for p in perms, then we get the permissions on the teacher model. Now let's say we want to add a new permission. We'll say new permission equal to permission dot objects dot create, and we'll put in code name equal to view grade strength, right? So the teacher will be able to view the current strength in that year-end section. Name equal to view grade strength, and then content type equal to content type. Now if you type in new perm, you can see that permission has been created, right? Now let's use another variable. We'll call that content type 1 equal to content type dot objects dot get for model, and again we pass in teacher, right? And then we use permissions 1 equal to permission dot objects dot filter content type equal to content type 1. And then if we say p dot code name for p in perms 1, then you can see that this permission has been added, right? So I hope you've got a fair idea of how content types works. Now let's move on. Let's talk about using the Django authentication system. At the heart of the Django authentication system is the user object. This user object has attributes. These are username, password, email, first name, last name. Of these, username and password are mandatory. Email, first name, last name are optional. As you can see, username, first name, and last name should be 150 characters or less. Let's take a deeper look at the user object by looking at the user model. The class is models.user. The fields first name, last name, email, and password are the default fields. These are the ones you saw on the last slide. We also have groups, which has a many-to-many relationship with the group model, that's with a capital G, and the class is models.group. We then have user permissions, which also has a many-to-many relationship, but with the permission model, that's with a capital P, and the class is models.permission. We have a Boolean type is staff, and this indicates if the user has access to the admin site or not. You may recall that when we created super user, right, Django automatically set is staff to true, indicating that the user had access to the admin site. Is active indicates if a user account is to be considered active. Now, if you do have inactive user accounts, rather than deleting those, Django recommends that you set is active to false. Why? Because if you do have a foreign key to users, then deleting those accounts may leave you with a broken foreign key. We have is super user, and this designates that the user has all permissions without them being explicitly assigned. We have last login, which will give us the date and time of the user's last login. And we have date joined, which gives us the date and time when the user account was created. Now, it's important to remember that in the Django authentication system, there is only one class of user. So if you're wondering about super users or staff, well, they're all the same class of user, but with special attributes assigned. Now let's take a look at the read-only attributes. We have is authenticated and is anonymous. Is authenticated is always true, does not check if a user is active, right? Also does not check if the user has a valid session. The class is the same, models.user. But is anonymous, on the other hand, is always false. It's a way of differentiating between the user object and an anonymous user object. Note that the model is different, right? It's anonymous user. And in addition, anonymous user will return username as an empty string, get username empty string, is authenticated is always false, is staff is also false, is super user also false, is active as well returns false, groups and user permissions are empty, right? In practice, you will mostly use is authenticated. Is anonymous is mostly used by web requests. Now let's look at the methods of the Django authentication system. And we have first get username. It's recommended to use this method instead of accessing username directly. We then have get full name and get short name. We also have set password, which sets the password to the given string we pass through raw password. Note that Django takes care of password hashing through this method, but this method will not save the user object. We need to explicitly call the save method to save the user object. In addition, we have check password, set unusable password, and has usable password. So check password will return true if the raw password is the correct password for the user. Set unusable password would indicate that the user has not set a password. Has usable password will return false if set unusable password is called. We then have get user permissions, and this returns a set of strings containing the user permissions. If an object is passed though, then this method will return permissions just for that object. We have email user, and this sends an email to the user. From the arguments, you may have figured out that this uses send mail, right? And so any keyword arguments to this method are sent to the underlying call to send mail. Now, what happens if from email is none? Well, then Django uses the default from email that we specify, as you know, in our settings.py file. Now, Django has a custom user manager that provides us with helper methods that we can use. The class is models.userManager, and one of the methods is create user that we will use during the next session of this module. Create user essentially will create, save, and return a user object. The username and password are set as given. The domain part of the email is automatically converted to lowercase, and the returned object will have is active set to true. If the password is not set, then set unusable password is called. We also have create super user, which is the same as create user, except that is super user and is staff is set to true. Now let's look at signals that the Django authentication system sends out when a user logs in or logs out. So the first one, we have user logged in, and this obviously is sent out when a user has successfully logged in. The arguments are sender, which essentially is the class of the user that logged in. Request is the HTTP request object, and we have user, which is the user object that logged in, or the instance of the class that logged in. We then have user logged out, which is called when the user logs out or when the logout method is called. Again, we have sender, which is a class of the user that logged out, or it could be none if the user is not authenticated. We have request, which is a HTTP request object, and we have user, which is the user object or the instance of the class that logged out. Again, this could be none if the user was not authenticated. We then have user login failed, and this of course is called when the user's login is not successful. The arguments are sender, but this is the name of the module that was used for authentication. We have credentials, which is a dictionary containing keyword arguments that consists of the credentials of the user. And we have request, which is the HTTP request object. Now let's go ahead and implement the Django authentication system in our code. To do that, let's go back to our code. And we start in the views.py file. Go to the enroll student view and just put in the login required decorator. Now, of course, we've got to run the server. Go to the browser and navigate to the home page. Click on enrollment and we are directed to this view, right? So this was our display message view we had created earlier. Now, why have we been directed here? The answer lies in our settings.py file. So come to the settings.py file and you can see we have login URL as /display message. So comment this line out. Now go back to the browser and back to the home page. Click on enrollment and we have an error, right? So if you look at this error, Django is looking for /accounts where in our project urls.py file, right? So now let's go to our project urls.py file and we'll add that path in. So that will be accounts / and here we will say include all the auth URLs. So that will be django.contrib.auth.urls, right? Then of course we need to put in a comma and that's all. So now let's try this again. Go back to the home page. Click on enrollment. Now we get a different error. It says template does not exist. If you go down the screen, you can see that Django is looking for a file called login.html, but where in our templates /registration folder. So we've got to create a registration folder within our templates folder. Remember, we are using the Django default authentication system here, right? So we're going to follow this. We'll create that folder now. So come back to your code and go to the templates folder. Here we are. Within the templates folder, create a new folder and we'll call that registration. Within registration, we'll create a new file and we'll call that login.html. Now for this particular template, we will not be inheriting from our base template. So we start with load static to load our styles. And because we're not inheriting from the base template, we need to include the link tag for our style sheet. Now we'll have a div class for styling Now the styles for this template you will find at a link in the description of this video. The link will take you to a file. Copy the styles into your style.css file, right? So this is the file. All these you can copy into your style.css file until this highlighted point, right? This is for the next session, right? So bring that into your style.css. Once you've done that, let's go back to our template. Now within this div, we will have a paragraph tag, and within that we'll have an h2 tag, just a heading there. After that, we have an HR tag, and after the paragraph tag, we'll have a break tag. Now we have our if tag, if form dot errors. So which form are we using? We're using the default Django authentication form that's already present. Therefore, we don't need to put in a view, right? You notice that we haven't really written a view for this login template, right? If form dot errors, we have a paragraph tag again. Within that, we'll just type in a message and an end if there, right? So if there are errors, then that form will reload. Now we check if next. So where the user has to be redirected after logging in is specified here, right? To next. And so we're checking for that. If next, then we have a paragraph tag, class for styling. And within that paragraph, we say, please log in to view this page. So we are restricting access to the enrollment page. Of course, we need an end if there. Now we have a form tag. Method is post. The URL, we're using the name argument here. And in the default view, the name is login. Within these opening and closing form tags, we start with the CSRF token. And then we have a table tag. Within the table tag, we have a table row tag. And within the table row, we have a table detail tag. The first table detail will be form dot username dot label tag, which will give us the label username displayed on screen. The second table detail will be for entry of username. So form dot username. That completes that first row. Second row, and again a table detail. This will be form dot password dot label tag. Right, so as you may have figured out, this is going to display the label password. And another table detail, and that's going to be for entry of the password. So form dot password. That's the end of the table. Now we need an input tag. Type equal to submit. Right, value will be login. Right, so that's the end of the template. Now we need to create a test user. For that, we need to go to our admin site. Log in using your admin credentials. Click on Add Groups. Put the name. That's all we need to do. Click Save. Now go back home and add a user. put in a username, password confirmation, click save. Notice that Django has set active to true. Staff is false, so no access to the admin site. Super user also false, right? Now we've got to add this user to this group. So click on registered users or whatever you name the group and click on the right arrow. You can see the date and time on which the account was created. Click save and that's it. Now you can log out of the site and now navigate to the home page. Click on enrollment. And there's no styles for me, right? I wonder if you've got yours. But let me start by deleting browser history. Now reload the page. Click on enrollment. But again, I don't have the styles. So let's go back to our template and check that error. Right, so here we have a percentage missing. So let's see if that's resolved the issue now. So go back to the browser and again, load the page. Click on enrollment and there we have it. Now log in with the username. Click login. And now Django is looking for a profile page. Now for this application, we're not going to have a profile. The resolution to this issue is therefore to go to your settings.py file and put in the login redirect URL. And that will be /app name /enrolled student. Right? So now check that the server's running. We need to restart that server. Go back to the browser and try that again. Click on enrollment and there we are. Submit. And that's it. But now we need the user to be able to log out, right? So that we'll do in our next session. So this is the end of part 1. Till the next time, take care. Bye.